We looked at how we can use the UVW map modifier to arrange 2D surfaces on 3D objects, and in that case it was really fairly simple 3D objects. So what do you do when you have more complex objects? Well, that's where the Unwrap UVW modifier comes in, and I'll be showing you how to use that in this video. So here I have a fairly simple decorative wooden box, and I'll be using the Unwrap UVW modifier to texture this, and I could potentially use the UVW map modifier for this, but the feet make it a little bit cumbersome to do that, and in fact I actually prefer using the Unwrap UVW modifier anyway, so this is going to be a great intro to using this tool. So here we have some original photographs taken of this box from different angles, and you can see it's quite decorative. We've got the top and then the sides and the front and back. So this is what we're aiming for. How do we actually get these images onto our 3D surface? Well, that's where the UV Unwrap modifier comes in. So in order to do this, the first thing I need to do is set up a material. And so I'll come to my material editor with M, add a standard material, and I'll rename this something like box mat. And to start with, I'm going to apply a checker procedural texture, and I do this just so I can test the Unwrap modifier as I apply it to see where I'm getting distortion and where things are working, where things aren't working. So I'll just link this into my diffuse color and go ahead and adjust the repeats on this. Perhaps I'll do something like 20 by 20, and I'll apply this to this object. And of course I need to come into my viewport, materials, shaded materials with maps, and straight away you can see we've got some serious issues here. This needs some work, and this is where our modifier comes in. So I'm going to select my object and apply an Unwrap UVW modifier, and this straight away looks a bit different from the UVW map modifier in that we don't have those basic projection types, and that's because this is all going to be done manually using UVW space. So what we can actually do is we can actually start interacting with the UVs themselves, only it's a little difficult to do in the 3D view. So what we'll do is we'll scroll down and we'll select Open UV Editor, and this is where the magic comes in of this tool. And what you're actually seeing is how currently this object is being unwrapped as it was left. Now if I actually remove the checker map from the background, which is actually showing me how this object will fit over my checker texture, it's a little disconcerting to begin with, so I'm going to remove this just by clicking on this show and hide the active map in the dialog. There we go, I can see my UVs a little better. So again, I'm referring to these as UVs when really they're just the vertices, the edges and the faces of these polygons flattened out, but I'm just going to refer to them as UVs in 2D space. Why do they look like this box pattern? Well, this started life as a cube, and the cube with the parametric creation parameters that were given to it when it was originally built, the cube is given standard box unwrapping, and so that's why it still kind of retains this through the history, but we need to start fresh. So while we could have applied this box mapping using the UVW map modifier, this gives us so much more control because I can see my UVs. In fact, I can actually go into sub selection modes, and I can go to vertex, and I can pick up an individual vertex or UV as it is in 2D space and start to manipulate how it sits across this 2D image. I can use my move tool here, and I can actually start to move and distort this, and as I move this around you can see how the texture is distorting in the lower bottom corner of this box. In fact, if I try and pick some other UVs here and bring back the checker map which is sitting over this unwrapped object and move these around, you can really see how I'm distorting this over that texture map. So that gives you an idea of what we're doing. In addition to picking up just the vertices, I can actually also click on my edges here, pick up an entire edge, move that around. I can even use my rotate tool to rotate it in 2D space, and I can also scale up and down. So it's similar to working in 3D, except this time we're only working in the U and V axes. I can also pick up faces, which can be useful if you're trying to make big movements or move a set of UVs that you're happy with into a different location. Now, to move all of these one by one would be very cumbersome. It would take a very long time to organize them into some form of sensible checker pattern where we don't see any of this distortion. Thankfully though, there are some automated tools to help us do this, and they're similar to the UVW map tools which project in different directions, but you'll find these actually nested in this Edit UVW's editor. If I come in here and actually pick up my polygon tool and select all the polygons that I want to rework, I can actually go to this explode section here, and this really is where you'll find some of these automated tools. In particular, I'm interested in this guy here, flatten by face angle. And what that does is it looks at this object from different angles, a number of different sides. It's similar to the box UVW map modifier, and it tries to find the closest match, so depending on the angles of these surfaces. If I click on this guy then, you'll notice that it's instantly tried to arrange and organize my UVs into a more sensible map. Everything's already looking better. My checkers all match in size. You can see my UV map. Everything just seems to be laid out in a much more sensible fashion. Now, while you might think this is okay to start texturing, we still have a little bit more work to do. And again, this is where complex models are going to start to take that much more time to UV. Good UVing is time consuming, but it's well worth it, and you're going to get much better results in your texturing because of it. So let's take a look around and see what we've got. We can figure out which pieces are which by actually clicking on this guy, select by element toggle, and I can actually pick up entire elements here now. I can see that this piece refers to this piece flattened out. This is this piece. This is going to be my underside here. These little pieces are the feet that have been removed, and I've got the top here. Now we've got some issues because you can see if I remove this toggle and go to edge mode, you can see that if I zoom in here, and I'm using the standard zoom tool, so Control and Alt and middle mouse button to zoom in and out, and then middle mouse button just allows me to pan around. If I select this guy here, this edge here, you'll notice that this is where I have that hinge, and it shows me I'm actually selecting this part here, little X, Y, Z axes appear, and I can see that this piece here, if I move this, is not actually joined to this piece here. So that's where we're going to do a little bit of stitching. So let's move these guys out the way, and let's figure out what they join to. If I pick up this, you can see that I'm getting some blue edges appear on the other shapes, and that shows you that this object here, as you can see, does in fact connect with this object here. They connect along this seam here, and that's what this blue part represents. That's the seam where we would stitch these together if we were to rebuild it in 3D. Now that's useful because it shows you what connects to what. Now if I pick up this edge here, again you can see that it shows me the connecting edge is this blue guy up here. This little piece needs to come into here, and that's where these stitch tools come in here. There are a number of different ways we can stitch. This first one is stitch to target. If I click on that, it takes the two edges and it pushes it to the target up here. Let's undo that. This one here is stitch to average, where it kind of joins them halfway. Still not right though, because it's caused all this distortion because I've moved it over that checker map that I've got here. So let's undo that. This guy here is stitch to source. If I click on that, it does the opposite, takes the target and joins it up to the source. Again, we're getting distortion though. This guy here is the most useful, this custom stitch. If I click on this, it actually moves the target all the way to the source. It stitches the two together and eliminates any stretching here. You can see that I've got that nice continuous texture now. Let's look at this edge. You can see that stitches to this guy here. So again, I'll use the custom stitch to pull those two together. And I've now completed this guy. This is all one element and it's all finished now. Okay. That's all fair and well, but when you actually come to paint this, because you've got this separation between the different pieces here, to paint a continuous texture would be pretty difficult. So the best rule of thumb here is to try and come away with as few seams as possible. You want to have as much joined as you can without getting any texture stretching. So that's kind of the challenge, and it really is a fine art. It's one of those practice makes perfect things. What I like to do is start by just moving all my objects out of the way, so I got a bit of breathing room. And let's start with this guy here. Let's remove this element and let's just go to edge selection. And I can see that this guy here, which is this edge along here, stitches to this blue edge here, which is the top piece. So let's just go ahead and stitch that together. I've just removed a seam. Well, this guy here stitches to this one here. I just removed another seam. And I can do the same with this one, stitch it, and this one, stitch it together. If I pick up this entire element now, I can actually move that so it's on its own. You don't want to have any pieces overlapping because they're sharing the same texture space. So they'd end up having the same part of the texture. In some cases that's actually useful, and I'll show you that shortly, but this would be an error because you don't obviously want the same texture painted on the bottom of the box as you do on the side. So let's move that out the way. As far as this goes, the underside, what I might do is accept the fact that I'm not going to be able to get these feet here to stitch nicely to anything because I can just kind of tell that through practice. So what I think I'm going to do is just move these feet just so they occupy less open space on my UV map. Think of this as real estate, this square here. This is where your texture is going to sit. And you don't want to have any wasted space, so you want to get your objects to fill this as good as possible. And we'll look at doing that later. Alright, that's coming along. Next we are left with these little feet here. We've got to figure out what to do with them. And it's just like when you're modeling something, there are typically multiple ways to do the same thing. And some people will have certain preferences and some people will have other preferences. So really it's down to the individual. In this case though, I'm actually going to make use of overlapping my textures. I know I've got a nice texture map to place on each of these side pieces. You can verify that in Photoshop. So why don't I make use of this nice portion of these feet, and rather than having to paint that twice, I can simply overlap these sections here over this section here. Reuse that part of the texture. So what I'll do is I'll switch to my edge selection and I'll start picking up these edges and seeing which pieces attach to those and just start stitching them together. Pick this one up, stitch it, and go ahead and stitch each of these. stitch, stitch, keep stitching them together. Okay, so I've eliminated any loose ends here, but the problem is, you can see that my checkers are kind of triangular here, while they're moving down at an angle. That's not too big a problem, but this isn't overlapping like I wanted it to. So we want this to share that same texture space as this. So let's pick up this edge and let's take a look at which one it is. It's actually this guy here. Let's move this so it overlaps this guy here. And what I could then do is clean up the fact that these checkers are not quite square, because that's going to be a problem, by using my rotate tool and just observing what's happening in my 3D view as I rotate this. You can see I'm starting to correct that distortion, and I could move this in just a little bit more with my move tool. That's looking fairly close. Now that's fixing those cubes, but you know, I'm actually still pulling this too far out because that texture isn't going to exist here. So for the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to move that in and overlap those like that. And I'll do that with each of these feet. I'll move this in and rotate it round. So I'll pause this and finish these last few. Okay, so that's now complete, and you can see that I've got no loose ends. I've decided where everything's going to go, and my checkers are looking good. Again, this checker pattern isn't the final texture, but it's just a tool you can use to make sure you're not getting any inappropriate stretching, because you might not notice that on your final texture, but it'll show up really easily on these checker patterns here. The final step then is to rearrange everything so it fits nicely inside this cube. This is where our texture is going to sit. So I'm going to use my face selection, pick up elements, and I'm going to grab this guy, move him into position, and I'll grab these guys and I'll move them as close as possible, but they're not touching. And last but not least, I'm going to scale this up so I'm wasting as little space as possible on my texture map. Now I don't want to have any of this distortion going on, so I'm going to hold down the control key to lock the aspect ratio and scale this so it's fairly close to those borders. And then we've got as few seams as possible and as a little amount of wasted space, but you know, as little as possible. It's kind of an in-between, happy middle ground. Now that I've got this, I'm ready to actually start painting my texture onto this 2D surface. Now because this UV map represents pixel data in U and V, one thing you should be careful of is to make sure that all the squares on the different portions of your model are the same size. So if I pick up this lower section here, and if for some reason I scale this up like this, what would actually happen is it would end up occupying more texture space. It would take up more pixels, and this would have a higher resolution than this down here. Now sometimes that's useful. You see that in games quite a lot, where the characters have higher resolution faces than the rest of their body, because that's what you see close up. But in our case, it's kind of a good rule of thumb to keep the squares the same size. We can now export this out then as a UV map. The way we do this is we go to Tools and we select Render UVW Template. Now this is where you decide on the size of your texture. For this guy, I'd probably go with a 2K map. You don't want to go too large. I probably wouldn't go above 4K. 2K is probably going to be good for single objects. If you had a whole room full of objects in your scene, then you'd probably want to manage, you know, higher and lower level ones. You only want to make them detailed enough depending on how close to the camera they get. So let's do 2048, a 2K texture. And we can pretty much leave these guys at the default and click on Render UV. Does that brings up the render view? Looks a bit strange right now, but that's just because I'm zoomed out. So if I do Control and click it to zoom in, that's at 1:1 and everything looks good. I can even see where my seams are based on the green. So now I've got that, I can save this as kind of a template, an image to start my UV mapping with. I click on Save, and I'm going to save this into my Scene Assets folder, Images. Raw is where I keep my raw photographs. I'll make sure this is a PNG, and I'm going to save this as Box UVW Map, and 24-bit should suffice, and I'm done with that. So back in Photoshop, here's our original source images. Let's go ahead and load up that template. Okay, it looks a bit strange right now, but that's because PNGs store transparency. So anything that was black is now transparent. So I'll bring up my layers, and I'll just add in a background layer. And this will be the kind of the background to my texture. I'll fill this with black, and now you can see my UVs. Excellent. So I've got separate UVs from that black background. Now I like to keep this on the top. So this is my UVW. This is my background. The general rule is you want to save out a working version and a final texture. The working version will be your PSD, and your final texture will be something non-native like a PNG or a TIFF. You wouldn't want to use a JPEG because that's not going to give you the best quality, because it's going to strip out information because it's a lossy format. So let's File, Save As, and I'll just save this as Box Text and save it as a PSD. Okay, so let's create a new layer, and let's decide how we're going to start with this. I think I might start by looking at this top section here. So I'm probably going to bring up my selection tool and just grab this top section here, copy that, and paste this in here. Now, again, just like UVing is an art form, just like modeling is an art form, so is texturing. I mean, this is a whole job description in itself. So you're going to need to practice to really get good at doing this. So I'll probably scale this to roughly, let's say roughly here. You might not get this right first time. You might have to try it out on the 3D model and then come back and refine it. I'm going to keep each of these on its own layer. Copy this. Paste it in. Now this piece obviously is going to rotate because I've got that groove here. That's going to fit this groove here. Let's use my transform tool again. Command T or Control T as I'm on a PC. And this is where I'm going to start trying to line up the feet with the UV map. It's not going to be perfect. You might have to scale things up and down a bit. You don't want to get it too small because then you'll get some of this grey background appearing. Let's go with that for now. And I might actually adjust the opacity on this layer so I can see where these circles should line up. Now, that's not too bad. I think that might work to start. So let's bring that back up and keep going. This guy can rotate around to this way so that these two little notches will line up. I'm just using my arrow keys again to nudge this around. It's a little too small. That's good enough. And the front of the box. Let's see if the hinges are here. That means this portion here is the back with the hinge, so the front goes up here. So transform, hold shift, and bring this in. And then lastly, we'll do this piece. Which goes down here. And try and get that hinge to line up somewhere in there. Okay, so everything's lined up, but we've got some real problems with the gray areas of the image, and that's where layer masks are going to come in. We can use that to erase those portions of the image. So I might start by bringing my top piece here right to the top of the stack, and what I'll probably do is add a layer mask. And normally I'd use a graphics tablet to do this, but unfortunately I don't have one at this moment. So let's just see if we can get this working using the pen tool or the brush tool. And on my layer mask, start painting black to start hiding this area here, and fading one image into the other. Maybe I'll lower down the opacity as I get closer. And you'll want to refine this and do a much better job than I'm doing here, but hopefully this is kind of a nice intro to how this works. You could use some stretching and transforming and cloning to move these sections that aren't quite lining up properly. There's times when a mouse just won't do, and I think this is one of those times. Okay, so that's kind of roughly lined up that top, and we've got some problem on this layer here. Let's figure out which one that is. This one. Again, let's add a layer mask. Start to remove that grey background there, and here. Same with this top piece. Layer mask. Okay. So that's a bit rough and ready, but it gives you an idea of what we're trying to do here. This section here, I could find another texture to place under there. In this case, I'm actually going to use one of my favorite resources for textures, which is actually myang.com/textures, and this really is a fantastic resource. These guys just decided to take tons of images and literally just built an archive of free, royalty-free textures online. They're fantastic resolution, and all they ask is that you manipulate these to an extent where the original can't necessarily be recognized. In this case, I would like the bottom of my box to have kind of a felt bottom to it. So maybe I'll pick a fabric for this and scroll down. Let's take a look. I think this welcome mat could be a good start just for this example. You can see this is a really high-res texture. It's taking a while to load. And if I zoom in, that's pretty high resolution. So for now I'm just going to copy this image, but I would recommend that you start to actually save a database of your own images. and I'm going to paste this into a new layer. Now by default it's way too big, so I'll just transform this down. And perhaps we'll rotate this around. We'll go with something like that. This is a little too bright, so let's just go ahead and perhaps just do a brightness contrast on this guy. So I'll apply an adjustment layer, we'll clip it to the layer below so it just affects that layer. And let's go ahead and take the brightness down, make it darker. Yeah, I think that's probably going to work. Maybe we could tweak that a little with the levels, but I think for this example that's going to work just fine. Now, the thing you want to be careful of is to make sure that you don't have the wrong texture appearing inside the wrong element here. For the time being I think we're okay, but a general rule of thumb is it's good practice to tidy up your textures when you're finished with them. And what I like to do is place a layer on top to do that for me. So to show you how I'm going to do this, I'm going to hide all of these layers, and I'm going to use my magic wand tool. I'm going to pick up this black area here. So I've selected everything but the insides of these UV maps here. And to play on the safe side, because I don't want to remove anything that might be inside where I want it to be textured, so I need to invert this guy right now because I'm selecting the outer portion. I need to select the inner shells. So I'll go to Select, Inverse, and then I'll just do a Select, Modify, and Expand, and 5 pixels will work. Click OK, and you can see that's expanded my selection out. With that, what I can do is actually apply a new layer, and let's go ahead and apply a layer mask to this. So applying a layer mask, you can see what that's giving me. This white area will show, the black area will be hidden. And firstly, to actually get this to do anything, what I need to do is, well, let me show you by bringing back these textures, and then I'm going to flood this layer with black. And it's gone the wrong way, so let's just invert the layer mask. There we go. And now we can see our texture's nicely cleaned up. So really this is just a bit of good housekeeping. So before and after, just to clean that guy up. So this guy's ready now. I can save my PSD. What I need to do though is save it into a non-native format. So I'll save it into a PNG. Definitely remember, hide those UV lines. Get rid of that template, otherwise they'll show up on your texture. So I can File, Save As, and go ahead and save this as a PNG. boxtext.png, and save. OK. Now we can come back into 3D Studio, and let's get rid of this and bring our material editor back up with M. Here's our material, and here's the checker that's currently going in. I know that this object is nicely UV'd now from these checkers, so I can delete this checker map. At this point I'm going to bring in a bitmap, and what I'll do is I'll attach my boxtext.png to this. Click Open, and this guy's ready to link up. I can link that into the diffuse color, and straight away you can see that's worked. Because my UVs were all nicely aligned, and because I painted my texture on that UV map, you can see that this guy is nicely UV'd and my texture fits over it perfectly. So what I can do then is I can select my object and make sure I'm on the Unwrap UVW Modifier, and I can open my UV editor. And you'll notice that it's still showing those checkers from before, only this time, in fact this is actually the default checker pattern that's in Max. this drop down in the top right hand corner, I can actually pick the checker map that I applied to my object before. But what I want to do is actually pick my own texture, in this case my bitmap, box texture, and you can see that's fitting perfectly on my UVs. I could continue to edit that if I wanted to, but I think that that's going to work just fine for us here. So that's using that as a diffuse texture. Lastly, what we can do is just add a little bit of an effect for when we come to render this out, and that's by adding a little bit of bump mapping. Now these bump maps are very easy to create, and you can actually use the textures that you've previously built in order to do that. So what I could do is, in fact, temporarily merge this down, and I'm going to make this a grayscale map. So in fact, let's do adjustments and let's do desaturate. And this will work fairly okay for a bump map, but what I can do is maybe just increase it a little bit. So let's go ahead and add an adjustment layer, and let's do a levels, and let's just pull up those whites a little bit, not too much. Bring down those blacks. So white areas are going to jump forward or appear to jump forward, and black areas are going to appear to not move at all, and grey areas are going to kind of be in between. And so remember, it's just a lighting trick. It makes it look like there's more detail on the object than there really is. So I'm going to save this as, I'm going to save this again as a PNG. This will be my box. This will be my box bump. Back in Max then, let's see how we can actually apply that bump map to our object. So let's open up our material editor with M, and again I'm going to bring in another bitmap node, and this time I'm going to bring in my box bump PNG, and I'm going to attach this to the bump input node of my material. Now if I actually look at the material, you'll see that it's currently at 30%, so the intensity isn't too intense. Let's actually zoom in on this and do a little test render, and while I'm at it I might actually switch to mental ray. Okay, zoom in a little bit more. So you can see this bump mapping is giving us this additional detail on the surface here. But bump mapping really starts to shine when you actually apply specular properties to your material. Now right now, my material has specular, the specular level is completely reduced, there's nothing there, where my box really should be slightly shiny. It's made of a polished wood, so we have to adjust our material accordingly. So let's increase the specularity somewhat. You could start to see that in this view here. And let's increase the glossiness. And let's do a render of this now. And now you can really start to see those little highlights appearing on that bump map. So if this was a smoother object, if I smooth this out, this would really give me some nice highlights along the top. But that's how a bump map can really help you out. In fact, we could go ahead and increase the intensity of that bump map a little more by, let's increase that maybe to closer to 40. Render that out again. Now we can really see that detail popping out. Perhaps that's a little too much, but hopefully you get the idea. So that's how we can use the Unwrap UVW modifier to actually texture more complicated objects, and it's actually my preferred method. In fact, this is a slightly simpler object, but it still works great. We've painted a custom diffuse texture map and then converted that into a bump map, a grayscale bump map, and used the same UV coordinates to apply that to the object. So have fun, and happy texturing.